I want to talk about pre-ordering versus renting. Cameras, lights, lenses, any kind of piece of equipment. You can always pre-order something if it's coming out, if it's a new announcement. Like recently we've had the Canon R5, the Sony A7S III. We've got cameras that I personally haven't used but I'd like to use, like the S1H, the Lumix S1H, their full frame mirrorless camera. A lot of these things are really cool, really exciting, especially if you're into photography, video, filmmaking, cinematography, creating content. It's a really exciting time because it's this new wave, this new batch of stuff. And I think it's something that comes around maybe every year, every couple years of like, should you pre-order? Should you rent? Maybe you stick with what you already have. And first and foremost, if you have equipment that works for your needs and you cannot afford additional resources, additional stuff, don't buy it. Don't pre-order it. Don't rent it. Use what you have to make what you make until you can afford to upgrade or switch gear or whatever that transition looks like. I would never say, hey, put yourself in debt just to have the latest and greatest. I think oftentimes we take it for granted just how incredible technology is, how cheap it is, and it's really easy to look at equipment from a couple years ago as outdated and kind of old technology. But that, like, movies have been made for decades, right? People have been making content for over a decade on the internet digitally. The stuff we had 10 years ago is awful compared to what we have now. And along that spectrum, things have changed, and pretty significantly. Things like the GH4, even back in the days of the 5D Mark II and Mark III, like, these cameras are incredibly powerful, and you can make beautiful content with a lot of even outdated technology by today's standard. There's even secondhand Red equipment or Alexas that you can find relatively cheap considering what they used to cost when they were brand new. So just keep all that in mind as we talk about pre-ordering and renting, because like there's always that underlying context of you don't have to upgrade, you don't have to get the latest and greatest. I personally am guilty of it too, just like the rest of us. Like, we all want the newest stuff because things like 4K 120 or 8K or 12K, these things are enticing for reasons because they're valuable. Better stabilization, better dynamic range, better color science, all of the reasons to upgrade, better autofocus. There's always a reason to upgrade. That's why they make new products, because they're better and they're an improvement and they keep us headed in the right direction. But you don't have to get every generation of camera if what you have already suits your needs. But if you're in the situation where you can afford to and you're looking at getting something new, switching systems, upgrading, whatever it might be, is it better to pre-order or is it better to rent? And I think right now where I'm at currently and where I have been for the past 5 years or so is renting makes a lot more sense for me personally. There are people out there who will pre-order cameras, pre-order lights, microphones, whatever equipment it is. They'll get it day one, shipped to them, they'll pay full price, and they'll do the review and they'll send it back. I think that's I don't know that that's right or wrong. I just personally feel uncomfortable doing it. Maybe that's unnecessary. But I just don't like the idea of putting, let's say it's a camera, spending $4,000 to pre-order something, getting it, and something could go wrong. Maybe it's damaged, maybe like my own negligence, I ruin it, I break it. Now I'm on the hook for $4,000 on something that I wasn't really sure that I actually wanted in the first place. I bought it just to review it or just to test it out, and I was always planning to send it back. Let alone the fact that once you buy something and then you send it back, now it's a used product that someone else is then getting, and who knows what you did to the camera. Maybe you got dust on the sensor, maybe there's debris in there that they have to clean out. It just makes extra work for no reason to just order things just if you know you're sending them back. Aside from that, the pressure of ordering something, testing it out, and feeling like, oh, well, I might as well keep it, is the other end of the spectrum, right? Where once you have it, you feel like, oh, well, I can't afford it. Maybe you couldn't really. You were always planning on returning it. You were going to save that $4,000 for something else that you really wanted. But now you bought the thing and you already have it. And yeah, it's not everything you wanted, but like it's still good. So you'll keep it and you don't really want to send it back. And now you're down $4,000 that you weren't initially budgeting. I think those are two easy traps to fall in when you're ordering things just for the sake of testing them, planning on sending them back. I just think it's kind of messy and unnecessary given the fact that you can rent. And that's why I think renting makes a lot more sense. So if we look at it and you look and you see, okay, to pre-order the a7S III, which is a really nice looking camera, everything that you would want from Sony in the a7S, they've added to the a7S III. $3,500. You can pre-order it. It's going to come out in September 24th. That's what it's expected. But to rent the same camera from Lens Rentals, which is who I usually use, it's like $175 for 7 days. You could use that for a project. You could use it just to test. You could use it for really, you don't even have to use the camera, I suppose. $175 in the grand scheme of things compared to $3,500 for the full price, I think is a reasonable amount to spend on a trial run. You don't have to worry about breaking or damaging it because it comes with insurance. You know you're going to send it back. You're on the hook for sending it back. If you love it so much, they do usually have rent to buy programs. So that's the other option there, right? When you're renting it and you go, oh my gosh, I love this, I can't give it back. You could say, hey, I actually want to buy it now. And then you can hand over the full amount. And that's why I think that's a little bit better way to go. Is it kind of an inconvenience to pay for something that you don't get to keep? Could that $175 go towards a lens or go towards a light or go towards a microphone or something else you need? Yeah. Could it go towards meals? Yeah. Could it go towards your rent? Yeah. But there's other things, right, that we spend money on. If you're in an apartment or you're renting your place, you don't own that property either, and you're renting it to use it for a time period, but you don't want the investment of owning it, and because there's just more of a headache that comes along with that. So there's pros and cons to each. I think in the camera world, where you can get something for 7 days for $175, that's the equivalent of $3,500 buying it outright, is a really good deal. It's shipped right to you. You open it up. They even like send it with the packing tape to send it back, because that's the thing I always forget is the tape, right? Putting it back in the box, when I send it back, I'm like, oh, I need tape. They even give you the tape. So renting is really, really convenient nowadays. It used to, you'd have to go to, the film supply company down the street, and they only had the really high-end stuff, and everything was just beat up and damaged and not that great because it was just like the local shop. And those places still exist, and they're usually pretty good, actually. They're not that bad, but they can be. Sometimes things can be a little worn and rough around the edges, and they can be that way online too. But I just like the value of being able to test something through renting it, having that feeling of, okay, if I don't actually like it, I'm sending it back. It's not that big of a deal to send it back, but if I end up falling in love with it, I can keep it if I want. That feels a lot better to me, even though I am paying for just like the experience of testing it. That feels better to me than buying a camera, paying the full amount, taking on this huge risk, and then getting it, and then now it's on me, the obligation is me to send it back and make sure the return goes well and that they get the return in the mail. I know that stuff is pretty streamlined nowadays, but it just seems like a huge risk and a huge burden that is maybe not worth it if you're not actually committed to buying the thing. If you are and you want it based on other people's reviews, then yeah, by all means. But the other reason I like testing stuff before I buy it, kind of try before you buy, is because so many of the tests that you'll see online are certain situations that are either stress tests or specific to that person and how they use their equipment, but you might actually use the camera or device in a slightly different way. One thing that comes to mind is the recent talk about the overheating on the Canon R5 and on the Sony a7S III for that matter. Do these cameras overheat? To what degree? Which codec? Which format? If you're using in this scenario, what if you're outside? What if you're inside? There's a lot of talk around them overheating and it being different in different scenarios depending on the person and how they're using the camera. What better way to test it than just to do it yourself? And right now, if you're on the fence because you're hearing people talking about it overheating, why would you want to buy a camera if you're not sure if it's going to work for your situation? Rent it, find out for yourself. In fact, I'm saying this because this is what I'm planning to do. I've put in my rental pre-order for the Canon R5 and for the Sony a7S III because I want to test them for myself. I haven't been shipped these cameras. Canon and Sony didn't reach out to me to say, hey, test out our new camera. We'd love to hear your opinions on it. I can't imagine why. So I want to put my money where my mouth is, test out these cameras to see, do these fit my needs? Because me personally, I don't want to say I shoot different than anybody else, but like I shoot my own unique way and my own style. And you'll see the stress tests where they'll just point a camera and let it record and say, oh, it lasted 30 minutes. Like you can record for 30 minutes and then it overheats. How does that work if you're doing clips and you're recording 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, taking a 2-minute break, starting again, recording 60 seconds, and then another 60 seconds and another 60 seconds, and then you take another half-minute break, and then you're recording for 5 minutes? Like actual production and workflow is a lot more sporadic and random than an isolated hit record for 30 minutes, the camera overheats. So I imagine a lot of people, the way they shoot, they might not have problems. Other people, depending on their projects, they may have the problems. What format are you using, etc. That's why I think it's really valuable for anyone to test these products, especially when they're questionable. No matter what the camera, there's no perfect camera. Everything has its quirks, its strange features and bugs, and it's good to get your own hands on it and see for yourself, going into it knowing what to look out for. If you have 7 days with a rental, you know, okay, in these 7 days, these are the types of things I want to try and accomplish with that time to make sure I actually am invested in this thing, rather than buying it with a pre-order, being really excited or maybe being hesitant or whatever your situation is, and then feeling like, oh, I'm obligated to keep it, or now I have to send it back, but that's a huge hassle because I'm traveling and then I'm not going to be able to get to drop off the package. Like, there's just a lot of risk there because it's just more expensive. It's inherently more risky. Can you walk away with, no cost to you? Yeah, you can do that. You can return it, say it didn't work for me, and your bank account stays the same. But for me, it's almost worth the $175 to avoid the hassle and the headache and just go, I'm going to do this kind of the proper way, what I feel like is the proper way, and test it out, see if it fits my needs, and then determine, okay, is this something I want to buy? Is it live up to expectations? Does it exceed expectations? Does it come in under and it's worse? Or maybe there's something that like no one's talking about that is unique to the way you shoot that you can then shine a light on and say, hey everyone, actually we should be talking about this other issue because it's way more important and really affected me. So that's how I like to look at it. I like to rent the stuff, test it for myself in a situation where online, a lot of times you'll see people using it in ways that make sense for them, but don't always translate to what you want to get out of a camera or the experience. And a lot of times it is more than just the spec sheet of what's on the piece of paper and what comes with the product. It's about the day-to-day use and how it stands up over time. The batteries overheating, because that's like the newest, trend or outrage, that these cameras are prone to overheating. And then other people saying, no, it's not that big of a deal. You're hyping this up and it's no problem at all. It's totally workable. And then other people, myself, falling on the other side saying, it's kind of ridiculous that these things overheat the way they do. But again, I don't have that personal experience yet, so I'm just talking from my kind of initial thoughts and impressions based on what I've seen out there from other people. Would I be able to use a Canon R5 or a Sony a7S III and it work exactly perfectly for my needs? Maybe, but that's why I want to rent them and find out so I can actually test it for myself and I'm not going off of, oh, this is the alpha version, or oh, they're going to update it with firmware, or once it ships, it'll be slightly different. Like, just get it in my hands, test it out so I can see exactly how this thing looks and feels and functions day to day on real projects, not just, hey, I was shooting some test footage and these are the problems I had, but like put it on an actual project, because that is the kind of throwing it into the fire where if you're testing it out and you say, oh, it overheats or whatever, and this may be a problem. If you're on a shoot and it overheats and it creates a problem for the shoot, you're not going to want to keep the camera because it's going to be such a pain point of like, well, never again. I'm never doing that again or dealing with that problem. Like, send it back. And because it's a rental, you can do that and it's expected. Renting is really cheap. I should also mention just like lenses or anything else that you need to rent. Like, there's so much good stuff that's like really, really affordable considering how much some of this stuff actually costs when you're talking about thousands of dollars on the line and it's like, $50, $100 for 7 days. I mean, that's a long period of time. You can do a lot of shooting in 7 days, and then you just send it back and you're only out a little bit, and it's not a huge burden on your wallet, let alone if you want to buy all these things at the same time to test them, right? If I want to test the Canon R5 and the Sony a7S III, and I want to test the S1H, that's $12,000, give or take, that I would have to go out of pocket to get those cameras in my hand and then have to return all that. And that's a lot to just front, the cost-wise. Whereas renting, much, much cheaper, much more reasonable. And are you out some money at the end of the day? Yeah, but you get the experience. And honestly, those lessons that you learn yourself from the hands-on can be far more valuable than the $100, $200 that it costs to rent it. So just something to keep in mind as we're all looking for the newest, latest, and greatest. Renting is a good option, and I think it's one that should be used more often, whether you're testing cameras or you need them for a specific project. Maybe you already have one camera and you need another, and you can't afford to buy another one because it's a big cost, but you just need it for one project. Go the rental route until you know you can actually pay off the camera with the projects you're getting. Because like I said at the beginning of all this, if you don't have the money, then don't buy it. And you can rent stuff much cheaper to work on projects, to earn money, to where you can build up savings to then buy what you actually want, which oftentimes is the best way to go about it. Looking over at the chat, does the a7S III have autofocus in 120 frames mode? Hello from Nepal. I actually don't know about autofocus on the a7S III off the top of my head. I'm sure you could find it on a spec sheet. I haven't tested it on the camera myself, so I still have to get that in my hands when it finally ships for rental, but I don't actually know off the top of my head. Other thing I want to talk about is negotiating prices with clients, because I think that's a good topic that a lot of people always want to know about. Like, how do you negotiate pricing when you're doing projects? Like, what is it worth? How do you get a good deal? Like, what should you work for? And I think it's worth talking about. How do you go about negotiating prices for your projects? For me personally, I have one thing that I maybe didn't always think this way, but I do now, and that is charge what you're worth. That's really abstract, that's really vague, so I'll go through it and kind of explain it and break it down. But just first and foremost, know you should always charge what you're actually worth. If you're first starting out and you have no experience, you don't know how to do, you've watched a couple tutorials, you have a camera, you have a light, but like you don't really have any experience, you haven't done anything professionally, I think in that situation, it is totally valid to work for free, to work for friends, to work for family members, to even get jobs for like really low pay if you don't actually have the skills that are like worth it. And how do you make that value call? I don't know. It's up to the individual, and I know that's a terrible answer, but you really have to look at the market, where you fit with other people, and what you think your services are actually worth. If you don't have a lot of experience, if you're brand new, I can tell you're probably at the lower end of the spectrum, versus if you've been doing something for a long time and you have a healthy body of work, you have a portfolio, you have a demo reel, you have a list of clients who would recommend you, well, then you know you have something of value to offer, so you should charge what you're worth, which to you is basically what is your time worth. And again, that's very subjective, that you have to figure it out and kind of do the math and like budgeting of like, how many shoots are you doing? How frequently, what's your frequency? Is it just you? Is there a crew involved? Like making sure everybody's paid, and then you have a little bit extra in case there's anything goes out of scope, and you can cover that. So there's a lot of variables to calculate, but it's just like budgeting and anything else. You look at it and you say, okay, what is this worth? Here's what I think it's worth. Making sure that all the math adds up, and you go from there. The one thing I would say that's really, really important is don't undervalue yourself for the sake of getting a job. You'll see this many times. People won't have work, and so a job will be presented, and they'll say, hey, can you do this? I don't have that big of a budget, so you kind of have to do it for like on the cheap. can you do that and make something amazing? And then it'll be kind of like your foot in the door, and it'll be the first step. And there are times where you might roll the dice and say, yeah, it's worth the risk because I want to make this relationship. I want to establish this connection. But I will tell you, it's very, very risky and very dangerous doing that. And there's a very good reason for that. And here's why. If you say, let's use some numbers, okay? If you say a project is going to cost you $10,000 because of the amount of people that are going to be on it, the equipment you're going to need, how many days the project is, like whatever the scope of the project is, you equate it to being around $10,000 worth of work. And they say, we only have $1,000. Can you do it for $1,000? You might look at that and go, well, 1,000 is better than zero. So, and I need the money. So yes, I'll make it work and I'll take the $1,000, even though you have to cut so much out of it. You got to strip it way down. You've got to do the bare minimum just to kind of break even at that $1,000 range. But hey, 1,000 is better than nothing. And I got my foot in the door. That can be the easy kind of immediate logic that presents, or the incentive where you feel like, well, I really should do this just to kind of put some money in my bank account. I would strongly advise against that, because if something was going to cost $10,000 to give a good product, to make a quality result, and let's say they pay you $1,000 and you deliver something that's on the caliber of $10,000, well, now you've just set yourself up for doing that same level of work over and over and over again for $1,000. Like, hopefully you follow that. It makes sense, right? If you deliver something amazing and they only paid $1,000, they're going to say, great, here's another 1,000, do it again. Here's another 1,000, do it again. Here's another 1,000, do it again, right? 10 times they could do that before you even equal the one project. Now, these are kind of extreme examples, but hopefully it paints the picture for you. That's the one risk, that you deliver something amazing and they want more of it, and they're going to keep undercharging you every time. Because you can't say, hey, I did it for 1,000, but really this next time I need 10,000. They're going to say, you did it for 1,000 last time, why can't we do that again? The other risk on that flip side of that coin is, let's say you cut so much out, you do bare minimum, you deliver something that's worth $1,000 and is not the greatest and it's not the best, but it's okay, it's fine, you did the job, you checked the boxes, and they're satisfied. Like, they're like, okay, great, good work, whatever. But like, you kind of know that it's not your best work. They kind of know it's not your best work. Next time they're looking to do something for $10,000, they're not going to hire you because what you delivered wasn't good enough. And when they have the budget to use their $10,000, they're going to go give it to the person who's the professional, the real creative, the better person than, that guy we hired last time, or that gal we hired last time, they weren't that great. We paid them $1,000. I think we need something better. Let's pay this other person $10,000. And that's how they're going to look at it. You undercut yourself and you delivered something lower quality, and then you hurt the relationship long term because now they don't trust you with the higher end work. And that's the other terrible outcome that comes from lowering your price and doing work on the cheap, is that the big projects that you want, that are worth it, that are profitable, that pay a crew to make compelling content, you lose out on it because you weren't able to deliver something that lived up to those expectations. In the first scenario, maybe you did, and then you're on the hook for doing that over and over and over again really cheap. On the other side, you actually deliver something that's worth $1,000 and then they don't want to work with you again because it's, in their eyes, maybe terrible. That's the risk you run. So I go back to what I said at the beginning. Charge what you're worth. If you're worth $10,000, you and your crew and your projects, charge that and stick to it. And maybe have some fluctuation up or down depending on the project and the specific details of, we're going to have to hire a few extra people for this one, or this one we can actually get by with a little bit less, so we'll cut some costs there. But in general, kind of know where you sit so that if something comes in severely under, hey, this just isn't right for me. And hopefully you have some savings to where you aren't on the hook every project needing the money, needing the income. If you need it, I can't tell you not to take it because everyone's going to, right? If you need it, you need it, and you're going to work for $1,000 and you're going to put it in your bank account because you need it. But if you have the option, if you have the luxury, maybe it is a luxury, but hopefully you've built up some savings so that you have some money in your account to where you can afford to pass on the lower paying stuff so that you can actually work for what you're worth. Because that's the most satisfying. That's the best relationship, when you get to charge what you're worth and the client gets the product that they deserve. That is the win-win, where both parties are happy. Any other way, and it's kind of a letdown on both sides. Now, that's not to say, like, don't overvalue yourself, right? Don't say, oh yeah, I'm worth $10,000 to take one photo or something like that. Like, I don't know, maybe you are, but like, be realistic about it. Look at it. What are other people in the market charging for similar types of work? You can find this many different places online, people talking about how much day rates are for certain projects and activities, and it varies region to region, market to market. In certain areas, things are more expensive. In other areas, it's cheaper. So it's this huge scale and huge spectrum. But look regionally, like what people are making, and then look at other postings online, like job boards, and there's web services where you can get hired to do different work like that, just like one-off kind of contract work. You can look at all that stuff and evaluate, okay, here's sort of where I fit. You know what gear you have. Are you shooting with like a GH5 or are you shooting with a RED? There's value difference there in terms of just hard costs of what the equipment costs. Are your lights the cheap LEDs that are like the cheapest of the cheap on Amazon, or are they more of a premium professional product that costs a little bit more, that have higher output, better quality of light? Like, the whole kit determine some value, and then your own skill set, how long you've been doing it, your expertise. Like, experience is critical. Most people's skills come from experience. It's not like you can just watch a bunch of YouTube videos and all of a sudden you know everything there is to know. A lot of it is hands-on work. The more you work, the better you get and the more valuable you are in the long run, because a lot of it is problem solving, and you go into a shoot and something happens and you have to adapt on the fly, and the more experiences you have under your belt, the more used to that you are. When I first started out doing photo and video work, I didn't know hardly anything. It's like I knew the camera sort of, and I had only done a few shoots, and it's like, well, like everything was new. Now at this point, almost everything has been done before, and so it's that process of doing it better and better and better and better, and refining it over time only comes with experience. That's valuable, and different clients value different things. Some people want someone with experience. Other people don't have a lot of money to spend. The thing is, and the beauty of it is, there is kind of a marketplace for everybody where everyone can coexist. There are clients who have a lot of money that want to spend it on the best of the best. And there's clients that don't have a lot of money and they want to take a risk on somebody new, and that can be a great opportunity for you to get experience that way. There is so much out there, and it's constantly changing, as we all know, right? You have to kind of adapt with the times, but video, photo, content creation, these things are essential in business, in the digital landscape that we all kind of exist in. These things are very, very valuable, and they have different levels of value depending on who's receiving those services. So just evaluate yourself, know where you sit, and then when you're negotiating with those clients and you're saying, hey, this is what I'm actually worth, be okay if you have to kind of walk away and you have to say, hey, this project just isn't right for me. I don't think, maybe you recommend somebody you know of that maybe is in like the higher bracket or the lower bracket, depending on which way you want to send them. But you just can look at it fairly and reasonably, because most clients don't know necessarily, right? They don't know what it takes to do the work. They just want to pay somebody who does. And most of the time, they're basing it off of a budget. They have a set number on a spreadsheet somewhere. They say, we have this much money to spend. They just want to get the best they can for that price point. But if that's significantly lower than what it's worth to you, then pass on the project. Give it to somebody else who needs that experience, who needs to do the $1,000 project, right? If you're at that $10,000 project mark and they only have $1,000 because on their spreadsheet they say, hey, we only have $1,000, let the person who like $1,000, that's where they're at and it's worth it. That's the project they should be doing, because then the next time that client has $10,000, they'll come back to you and they'll say, hey, that really didn't work out that one time. Granted, it worked out the way it was supposed to with that person who's less experienced. They got the experience, they leveled up a little bit. Then the client will come back to you and say, this time we want to do this right. We want to do it a little bit better. This is more important to us. Last time we talked about this one price, like, could you do it again for that same price? And you go, yeah, absolutely. And you deliver an amazing product because now you're getting what you're worth. And that's where you want to be. Again, there's gray area where if you need the work and you need the money because like you have to pay your bills and feed your family, like, yes, I understand all of that. I'm talking about kind of in a perfect world where you get to kind of pick and choose and you have control over what you're working on. Don't undervalue yourself. It's probably not going to ever work out for you in the long run. You'll either be on the hook for doing really high quality work for really cheap and no one wants to be there, or you're just going to underdeliver and they're going to pass on you for the next time in favor of somebody better. So just keep all that in mind, because it's an easy trap to fall in of saying, well, I'll take the money now for maybe some future payoff, but usually it doesn't work out that way. It's almost always better to charge what you're worth. I'm back over in the chat. I see there's some message retracted. Well, I don't know what you said. I missed it. The last thing I want to talk about is the setting boundaries with clients, because that kind of goes hand in hand. Like negotiating the prices is important up front, but setting boundaries can be even more valuable. So I think that's something good to talk about. Clients can be very demanding, and it's important that you set some good boundaries with them because it's a healthy working relationship. Most of the time, clients don't know what it takes to actually do a project. If they did, they would be the ones doing it. But no, they've hired you or someone like you for the project because you have the experience, you have the expertise. But that means it's on you to set those proper boundaries and expectations, because again, they don't know. This is really important, and something I used to be worse at and I could probably always be better at, is just setting the right boundaries, setting the right expectations, and being forward with communication. A lot of times it's easy to assume that everybody knows exactly the process and the workflow and how things need to go and what's a reasonable request versus an unreasonable request. But the truth is most people don't. They don't understand cameras, technology, production, whether it's video or photo, filmmaking. They just don't understand all the ins and outs and the complexities of like why things can be a lot harder than other things. Even if you look at something that's kind of like hard to conceptualize for most people, I would say, is just the difference between like 2D and 3D animation. You can look at them and say, oh, these are obviously different, but which one is harder? Well, that's hard to say. Which one requires more expertise? Well, I don't know. Which one is worth more? I don't know. They're different and they have very different workflows, and there's different ways to do each one of them. Same thing is said of like if you have an hour-long video versus a 30-second video, the revision process is going to be very different for those two pieces of content. The process for producing those pieces of content is going to be very, very different. So when you're setting boundaries with clients and you have a project, you have to take those parameters into consideration of like, what is the actual deliverable? What are we making? What are we doing? And then setting the expectations up front. And at each step of communication, saying what happened before, like where we just were, what's happening currently, and then what's about to happen next. So that way people are comfortable as they go through the process, start to finish, and they can look at it and go, okay, yeah, I do remember that's what we just did. This makes sense where we're at. And okay, sounds good for the next round of whatever it is. If it's entering pre-production or entering production or entering post-production or doing revisions or finalizing or whatever it is. Saying simple things of like where the color's at on something, right? Color grading is usually something I save for the end of my project because it doesn't usually make a lot of sense to do it at the beginning, at least final color. There's some nuance there. I do usually do some color, so it's not like log and saying like, hey, imagine good looking color. It's like, no, just know like I've put some color on here, but it's not final. So if you have, and I might even say something like that, say, hey, there's color on here, but it still isn't the final color grade. I'm going to do a final color pass. If there's something that you want me to pay particular attention to, just let me know. And that way you don't get the feedback of like, why does the color look so bad? It can be more of like, hey, this one spot looks a little green or it looks a little weird. Can you look at that and make sure it's fixed? so that way communication isn't frustrating and people are criticizing things that they're not necessarily supposed to be criticizing. The other thing, revisions, when you're doing them, you can ask for specific revisions. You can say, hey, can you look at this portion or this piece, or what do you think of this? I want feedback on just this. Don't look at this other stuff. That's also very helpful to kind of frame the conversation, not just send something and say, what do you think? That's very open-ended, direct. Hey, how does the audio sound? I'm really working on the music. What do you think of it? Like if that's the type of feedback you want, start that conversation yourself. The main thing with setting boundaries is just being proactive, leading up front instead of constantly having to recover from an unexpected note or circumstance that's thrown at you. If you're going into production and you're going to say, here are the people that are going to be there. This is the time we're going to be there. We're going to be there until this time, right? The end of day. This is how long we're going to be there. Setting up, if you have some kind of overtime policy, letting the client know that up front, saying, if we go past this time, we will enter overtime, which is time and a half or double the rate, however you have it set up for your specific situation. Knowing all that up front is really good rather than being on set and 8 o'clock comes around and you go, hey, now we're entering double time. And they're like, wait, what's happening? No, I didn't sign up for that. And then that way, if it is that situation, you say, hey, and you did tip them off before, you say, hey, after this time, that's when we're going to enter overtime. That time can happen on set and say, as you recall, as I told you, now we're entering overtime. Is that okay? Or should we just call it a day for now and come back tomorrow? All of that stuff is a lot easier conversation to have when you've set those boundaries up front. Always be proactive. Lead with the restrictions and stipulations and if this, then that, but if this, then that. The more that you can kind of role play and strategize and theorize of what's the worst case scenario, what's the best case scenario, paint those pictures for people, they're going to be a lot more understanding of when those things take place. Hey, best case scenario, we're done by 4 o'clock. So when you end at 4 o'clock, they know, hey, this was a great day. Awesome. Worst case scenario, we might be there till 9 p.m. And then 8:30 rolls around and they're like, well, we got 30 minutes left. That's the kind of stuff you need to do up front at every single step of the conversation. If you're in scripting, hey, take a look at this. This is where we're at. This is what needs to be addressed. I'm going to do 2 more rounds of revisions on this as per the contract. There's so much communication that seems unnecessary, right? If you have a contract signed up front and everyone's agreed to those terms, it can be easy just to assume, yeah, we're all on the same page. But people forget what's in contracts. They forget what they signed a week, 2 weeks, a month ago. You have to always remind them and say, and not in a mean, aggressive way of like, as per the contract, just say, oh yeah, and if you do it, my point is being proactive and doing it beforehand, right? So you can lead into these things and it's not after the fact of, oh, that's actually going to be an extra $10,000 because of such and such a fee as per the contract. They're going to be like, what in the world? Wait, you didn't tell me this was going to happen. Set those expectations, set those boundaries up beforehand. And the more experience you have doing this, the better you are at figuring out like, what is the common thing that happens all the time? What's most likely to happen? Typically, it is extra rounds of revisions, I would say. If you have a project, revisions can eat into your time. You might budget for a round or 2 of revisions, and then that can go on to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rounds of revisions. Now every next round eats into your profits, your whatever you made on the project. And so you've really got to set those things up front and say, this is what we're going to address. And what I personally like to do in that situation to avoid it, I make my rough cut as good as possible so that way the revisions are minimal and I can say, hey, here's the video. What do you think? The only thing I have left to do are X, Y, and Z, which is probably color and audio typically, and maybe some graphic stuff. But for the most part, I want things pretty close to final on that rough cut. I want people to provide valuable revisions, not having to use their imagination. You've seen cuts like that, I'm sure, where there's just like, 30 seconds of black, and it's like, imagine an animation here, or this is where we're going to do the montage that we haven't filmed yet, or this is where, and now the person's watching it and they can't actually give feedback because they're just looking at a black screen and they have to use their imagination. So when that thing is finally filled in on the next round or two of revisions, now they're actually at a point where they can properly review it. So whenever possible, give the most information. That way you get the most valuable information back. If you don't communicate, you're setting yourself up for failure and for problems down the road, because now people are on different pages. People have different assumptions. The client's thinking one thing, you're thinking another thing. And as I said, you're the one that knows how to actually do it. They don't know. They just know, they kind of know, well, like, we hired this person to do this thing and they're not getting it to us on time. Lead them. It's, kind of hold them by the hand and walk them through the process so they know what just happened, where they're at now, and where you're going next. That's the safest way to operate. You're going to have problems. There's going to be issues. There's going to be maybe a little drama here or there of something unexpected. But those are a lot easier fires to put out than someone going way over budget and not planning on it, or your time is sucked into something that you weren't even planning on doing. There's just a lot of bad outcomes if people aren't all on the same page, operating from the same set of boundaries and expectations up front. Back in the chat. How bad is dynamic range of Micro Four Thirds compared to full frame cameras? Is dynamic range and the background blur the only downsides of Micro Four Thirds? Sorry, noob question. No, that's a great question. So I don't want to, typically a full frame camera is gonna probably have better dynamic range than a Micro Four Thirds camera, typically. But that's not always true. I don't have the right sensor expertise and knowing how a sensor is actually made to tell you the definitive reason for why that is. But in general, yes, a full frame camera is probably going to have better dynamic range than a Micro Four Thirds camera. Does that mean the Micro Four Thirds camera has terrible dynamic range? No. And is it still usable? Yes, absolutely. The thing that's usually going to affect dynamic range the most is whether you're shooting RAW or you're shooting like a pre-baked codec like H.264 or ProRes. If you're shooting RAW, you're likely going to get a lot more wiggle room because you have a lot more information stored from the sensor. The raw sensor data is going to expand your dynamic range compared to compressing stuff into a ProRes codec or H.264 or H.265, whatever it might be. So usually that's where, if you're really trying to optimize dynamic range, you're probably going to be looking for a camera that can shoot RAW or can output RAW via HDMI now. Like on the S1H, they have the update that does RAW to the Ninja 5, the Atomos Ninja 5, ProRes RAW, that is, which I'm hearing good things about. I haven't actually tested it myself, but I'm hearing good things that ProRes RAW is relatively easy to edit and it gives you a lot more dynamic range, which is to be expected, right? That's why Red was like the holy grail for a while. Of like Red RAW is just like so amazing. It's so flexible, so much dynamic range, and they're great cameras. Blackmagic with the Ursas, can shoot RAW. The Pocket Cinema camera can shoot RAW. There's plenty of cameras that are able to shoot RAW now, and some of them are Super 35, some of them are full frame. It really just depends. Every sensor is going to be a little bit different. Every camera is a little bit different in how it handles that. And then it gets even deeper than that. RAW, you've got 12-bit RAW, 16-bit RAW, 14-bit RAW. There's compressed RAW, there's uncompressed RAW. Like it's a nightmare of codecs and tech and behind the scenes stuff that I'm not a software engineer, so I don't actually know all the ins and outs of all that stuff. But typically that's what you're going to be looking at for dynamic range is RAW. And then the background blur, so background blur, that would be your shallow depth of field. People like to go both ways. People will say a full frame camera has a shallower depth of field than a Micro Four Thirds camera. That is technically not true, but it is true in practice. This is really hard to explain without showing it, but hopefully I can paint a good enough picture of why this is the case. A full frame camera has a wider field of view at the same focal length. If you put, like, let's use numbers. If you put a 35 millimeter lens on a full frame camera, that's a wider field of view than a 35 millimeter lens on a micro four third camera, because the sensor is smaller. So like every lens projects the same image circle, and then a full frame camera sees the whole thing, and then a micro four third camera sees like a crop of it. That's why it's a crop sensor is typically how it's called. But like the image circle is the image circle for the lens, and it's just the full frame sees more of that image circle. So it has a wider field of view. In practice, what that means is that you can get certain shots that are wider, and that dictates where you put the camera in relation to the object. So oftentimes that means you can maybe get closer to the subject, to the object, get it in focus, and you have this wide field of view and this perceptibly shallow depth of field. To get that same look on the micro four third camera, because it's cropped, you'd have to back up, in which case you're not as close to the object, so you're focusing a little bit further away, and that's going to make your depth of field less shallow. Optically, it's going to look shallow. But if you compare like a 35 to a 35, and you set up the same shot, the exact same distance, everything's the same, one's going to be cropped in, the other's going to be a little bit wider, but they're going to have the same depth of field in terms of like the depth of field is what's in focus. The background blur is going to be the same. The reason you don't usually hear people talking about it like that is because that's not really how people actually shoot. If you have a bigger sensor, you're going to shoot different than if you have a smaller sensor. You're going to use different types of lenses. The thing that affects depth of field is the aperture, right? So a 1.4 lens is a shallower depth of field than that same lens at like f5.6, right? You stop the aperture down, you make a smaller aperture that increases the depth of field, which again, the depth of field is what is in focus. This is a lot of, I would say it's basic information, but it's information that a lot of people get wrong, can easily be confused about, can say the wrong thing. Oftentimes it's tricky to talk about depth of field, because when you talk about depth of field, people are usually talking about the background being blurry, but the depth of field is what's actually in focus. That like the depth of field is is how much you have in focus forward to back. And so in general, you can think of it, the easiest way I think to think of it is that yes, full frame cameras do present a shallower depth of field, because in practice, that's how most people use them. Do they technically? Do they literally? No, the sensor doesn't actually affect the depth of field literally, like the sensor itself doesn't, because again, the image circle is the image circle, and it's just a crop of it. Like nothing has changed optically about the depth of field based on the sensor alone. But in practice, by moving things around and where you're able to film from, that is what then makes it perceptibly a shallower depth of field, just because you're able to use like an 85 on full frame is wider than an 85 on a micro four third. So to get the same compositions, the same placement of objects, it's just different because the sensor is different. So you end up shooting a little bit different, and then you'll look at a full frame camera and you go, oh my gosh, I want that blurry background bokeh. I need a full frame camera for the shallow depth of field. And then you'll have someone on the internet say, oh no, it's not the sensor. But it kind of is. I mean, that's why people want to shoot medium format and go bigger than full frame, right? Medium format cameras also have a shallower depth of field, because in practice, they have a wider field of view, and that changes how you compose your image and how you shoot. So it's a really hard thing to explain without visuals, but hopefully that helps. Also, do clients pay photo videographers beforehand or after getting paid the work is delivered? I'm super new to this, so genuinely curious. Well, I would recommend, it's risky for both sides. So the client doesn't want to pay a bunch of money up front and then have the photographer, videographer just, take their money and run away and they don't deliver the project. At the same time, you don't want to be a photographer, videographer, deliver a project, and then the client just disappears and doesn't pay you. So it is that kind of not a handshake agreement, because hopefully there is some kind of contract in place. But typically what I like to do is like either a 50-50 or some kind of payment terms where there's some portion paid upfront to cover upfront costs, and then there's another payment after delivery or upon delivery. That way, if any point along the project things go sideways or doesn't work out or for whatever reason, there is still some upfront cost for just the association of like getting the project moving. So I wouldn't do it in like one large lump sum either upfront or at the end. I would say split it up depending on the project of like what costs you have. Figure out, okay, these are the payment terms. We're going to take this much upfront, and then once we deliver something, then you can pay us the second half. And that way you're kind of protected and insulated. It's not always perfect, but it can help just to make things feel, I think it makes things feel more professional for one and just more legitimate, but also just to help make sure that everyone's interests are covered. Any tools to accurately estimate your used gear value? I would look at Amazon, what people sell their used gear for on Amazon, because then you can usually see like what other people are selling their stuff for. If you have some really unique piece of gear that like no one is selling on Amazon, I would also check eBay. I would check Craigslist. I would check Lens Rentals or any other kind of rental site that also sells used gear. Adorama sells used gear. B&H probably sells used gear. I've never bought used stuff from B&H, but they must, right? They have to. So I don't know if there's like a tool, like a software platform. Maybe that's something that you should develop and invent, just to check the price of your gear, like you have for like cars, right? That's a thing, for cars. Like, hey, what's my Kelley Blue Book? What's my car worth? I don't know if anything like that exists for cameras and video equipment. There's another group called, is it ShareGrid, where I think you can share and rent your gear to other people. And I know I've never used it myself, but that's another thing, kind of using used gear or people's gear that isn't brand new, that can be kind of rented around. So I'm not aware of any tool, but that'd be interesting if there was something like that, like an app or something. You could see, hey, how much is this worth? But usually I just check Amazon and see, okay, this is what GH5s, like that's what I have, right? If I'm selling a GH5, what is that worth on Amazon buying used? And you can sell right on there too if you set it up, or you look locally, which Craigslist typically is, you will get better deals because it's like a local. Facebook Marketplace is also a thing now. There's like so many, there's OfferUp. There's so many different ways people sell stuff now. So it's kind of like going with the biggest ones where most stuff is, because then you have more people that are looking. And I figure I've bought a few used things off of Amazon, and they've been pretty good. So no issues there. Completely different subject. How do you stream and record the full quality video? That is an interesting question, and it is different for everybody, that's for sure. But right now I'm streaming with OBS, and so I'm streaming and recording with OBS. That way, if I pop over here to my screen and I move around and I scroll down and do all this kind of interactive type stuff, all of that can be recorded the same. So I'm recording with OBS on the laptop so that it's not interfered with like the internet connection, because of course a stream is always at the mercy of the internet connection. If the internet dies, the stream dies, the recording dies, everything dies. I record locally to make sure I have a good clean backup that then I can clip out into the different segments for the specific videos, because I understand not everybody wants to watch a live stream, right? They're not there at the time, it's too long, they don't want to listen to me rant for 2 hours about Canon R5s overheating because they think I don't know what I'm talking about and that I'm being ridiculous, and it's a photography camera, even though they advertise the video features. Go figure. But yeah, anyway, so I clipped those small ones from the recording. You could theoretically record on the camera as well, but that's if you record on the camera, you're not going to have, like if I pop over here, you're not going to get this stuff. So there's a microphone right here. It's a sorry if this hurts your ears. It's just a little, this is an Audix SCX1. I'm sure that's not a fun noise to listen to as I'm touching the microphone, so I apologize for that. But that's XLR right into the camera. So that way, so what's really important on a stream is that the audio and video are in sync. And the best way to do that is to run the audio to the camera, and then from the camera, send that signal to the computer in this case. So that way the audio and video are matched. If you run video to the computer and you run audio to the computer, that's where you can end up with some sync issues, and you have to add delays and whatnot, because just in that conversion of the video coming in and the audio coming in, they just come in at different times. You're talking milliseconds, but it can be distracting. So I find the best way to do it is run the audio to the video camera, video and audio out from there into the computer. And right now I am using a cam link, so I can show you what that is if you've never seen one. Cam link is one of these. It's Elgato Cam Link. This is the 4K one featured here. I believe I have the original one, which doesn't do 4K. I believe it does. It's 1080, because I'm pretty sure this is like $300 now, or maybe mine does do 4K. I don't know. I'd have to check it, but I'm pretty sure I got mine a while ago, so I don't know that it's 4K or not. I'd have to test it. But right now I'm just doing 1080 for simplicity. Maybe I'll switch to 4K if I can do it. But anyway, so yeah, you can see new and used. What do we got price-wise? Like $126, $160, like really cheap for what it does. Because basically what it does is it takes HDMI in the one side and then it puts USB out the other side. And what's great about that is you can trick it tricks your computer into thinking it's a webcam. And so basically you can turn any high-end camera, shallow depth of field, good quality signal. You can make your computer think it's a webcam with the cam link. So that's what it does with just USB. So just like you pick like your FaceTime camera or any web camera on your laptop, you can pick the cam link, and it's just having HDMI in. So as long as your camera can output a clean HDMI signal, or you can convert your signal to HDMI somehow, and keep it clean, meaning there's no menus and stuff, because some cameras do that, right? They actually have a helpful, if I'm remembering correctly, Elgato Cam Link. Sorry, I'm typing with one hand and one finger because the computer's a little bit far away. So they have a camera check for the Cam Link, where you can look at all the supported cameras from all the different brands to make sure that, oh, okay, Panasonic, like, oh, the S1H is on here, the GH4, the GH5, and you can see the specifics. What's the maximum resolution? Does it have clean HDMI? You can see some on here like the GX 850, like for whatever reason doesn't do clean HDMI. But almost all the Panasonic ones, aside from the LX10 and this one, like don't. And this isn't every camera that Panasonic has ever made, but it's like the, you know, a lot of the more recent ones that have been tested. You can go to GoPro and see, okay, hey, all the GoPros work. Let's see, Sony, the RX104 for whatever reason has some kind of warning issue. It's got a little yellow ticker there, but the RX105 does work. So you can check all that out and see, okay, these ones work, these ones don't, and basically your computer treats it like a webcam, which is really, really cool. So anytime you want to do a stream with a good camera, it's like $100-$200 for one of those cam link converters. And then as far as the rest of the setup, it's just like lights. Hopefully you can see how I'm lit to kind of figure out where I have lights positioned. But that's it. It's relatively simple. The real magic is the cam link. That one device is, when I saw that was a thing, I think it was like a couple years ago, I immediately bought it because I was like, this is genius, this is perfect. Because before that, Elgato was making game capture stuff. So I have one. There's a game capture, for streaming, Xbox or PlayStation or any of those kinds of things. And it was like, oh, what, can you plug a camera into these? And then those boxes were so big and bulky, and then to have just like a little USB dongle that you can take anywhere. It doesn't need power. It just plugs right in and just converts. It's it's really cool that it works the way it does, because most computers, you can't plug HDMI into them. Some of them have HDMI output for monitoring on a screen, but very few of them have any kind of HDMI input. So sometimes it can be a challenge getting video signal into a computer live, but all you need is that little cam link, and that does all the work for you. Looking back at the chat, will filmmakers eventually choose autofocus instead of doing it manually? Autofocus are getting really good. I would say yes, probably a lot of people will, especially with some of like the eye detection type stuff. Built into the camera, would you trust it all the time? I mean, photographers have gotten to that point where the autofocus, that's how most of them do it, right? There's a few situations where you might find yourself having to do manual focus photography, but in general, most of the time it's autofocus, I would say. You know, most people are shooting that way. The trick with video, though, is that it can autofocus, you know, in sequence, right? From picture to picture to picture to picture, because that's what video is, moving pictures, motion pictures, right? But it's like, how is it focusing between those intervals? Is it jittery and stuttery and like constantly searching the whole way? Because that is not what you want. And it's refining that process to be tracking smoothly, but not like hyper tracking where it's, you know, too much and too aggressive. And so it looks very natural and fluid. And then what happens when the person turns and like you lose sight of the eye? Then what do you do? So I think for things like I know a lot of wedding videographers rely on autofocus because it's kind of a live event. Things are happening. They don't always have time to be pulling focus, especially when they have to shoot with these ridiculously wide apertures because they might not have light in the room. It's really dark, so they need to shoot at like a 1.4 or something like that. I mean, Sony is kind of clearing that up, just the A7S being really good in low light. But still, there's times where you need to be able to see, and so you got to shoot with a shallow depth of field, and having a camera that can pull really good autofocus for you, I think we'll get there. I just don't know that we're there yet. And how common will it be in like professional setting? I don't know, because I feel like most professional people want more of like the control over it. Like no one, even though like auto white balance does a pretty good job, I would never use auto white balance on a shoot because like I know the problems associated with it of like my colors constantly changing, even though it might be gradual. Now I'm color correcting and I'm always chasing this moving kind of point. I would never use auto exposure, even though cameras are relatively good at that too now, of, you know, compensating on the fly, whether it be ISO or the aperture. I wouldn't shoot video that way with auto exposure either. So would I shoot video with auto focus? Maybe in certain situations, because each of those, auto white balance, auto exposure, and auto focus, do have a place. There are times where it is run and gun and you don't know what you're getting into, so you're just like auto white balance because I'm running around and it's crazy and I don't have time to dial it in every scene. Is that happening often? No. Most of the time I dial in my white balance so it's locked. Same thing with auto exposure. Is it theoretically possible that you would just need to be running crazy and have it in auto? Maybe. But how many times am I in that situation? Not often. I'm always shooting manual, basically everything. So I think it'll probably stay the same for most of the time for me personally with manual focus. Although I do see the benefit of having good autofocus. It's something I want, and I wish the GH5 did better. It's something that is inconvenient that it's not on the Ursa Mini. I wouldn't expect it to be there, but like, you know, more options are good, and the better the technology gets, the better for us all, because it unlocks really good opportunities for filming in situations where, for example, if you want to film underwater and you don't have direct access to control focus, put it in auto and, like, you know, because it's in an underwater housing, put it in auto and like hope it gets things in focus. In that situation, you want the autofocus to be the best that it possibly can be. Are we always shooting underwater? No. So it is kind of a project to project type of thing, but I don't use auto white balance and auto exposure. I don't use autofocus in video hardly all that often unless I have to. So it's just for those times when you have to use it that you want it to be better. I thought you could lose all the recording if the stream suddenly stops. That would be a nightmare. That theoretically is possible if like OBS were to crash, but it is streaming to YouTube directly, so I could always get it after the fact. That's a lesser quality, but it's not like it's gone, right? I could download it afterwards. So I just record locally. Theoretically, could you output my display? Could I mirror my display? I could probably set up, I could mirror my display somehow and then record it on like an Atomos. I have a Shogun Inferno right here. Any kind of external monitor recording device, you could do it that way where you mirror your display. But then I would have to make, that would be really hard to control. I don't know if I could send from OBS a final output to a screen. I'm sure I can. I'm sure there's a setting in there that you can figure that out. That's an extra layer that I don't feel is necessary at this point in time with this current setup. The other way to do it theoretically is if you had everything switched outside of the computer. So you had some kind of live switchboard where you were pulling all your inputs and outputs and then just sending signal to the computer to stream. You could theoretically send two different signals, one to the computer to stream, one to a recorder. I don't have that set up here right now, so that's not something I could do right this second. So for the most part, I feel like this is working pretty well, but if it looks bad or sounds bad, let me know. But yeah, for the most part, it's pretty easy, easy to set up. OBS is a good choice, but there's also a few other, like Vimeo does live streaming now with their kind of browser version, and then they have like an OBS type equivalent you can download. I think it's called Studio 6 from Vimeo. I like OBS because it's free, and it's kind of the standard that a lot of people use. There are a few other ones. Is there Cam Live or something like that? I've someone's mentioned it in the chat before. There's a few other solutions for streaming. StreamYard is another one that I've used before that I really like, that I have some ideas of how I would use that. It's a little bit different than OBS, and it has some benefits and drawbacks. It's just like the cameras, use the right tool for the right job. Certain cameras excel in certain situations where they don't in others. Like the Ursa Mini is a great camera that looks awesome and records beautiful footage, but it is bigger and bulkier than a GH5. So other times if I want to be streamlined and really lightweight and run a gun, the GH5 might do the job, and it's got internal stabilization, and the flip screen actually flips all the way around. That's the one thing about the Ursa Mini. The flip screen flips, but it doesn't flip all the way around. So if you need to do selfie stuff or set up a shot in a corner, you can't always flip the screen around. And the Ursa Mini is heavier than the GH5. So it's just picking the right tool for the right job. It's probably just picking the right tool for the job rather than picking the right tool for the right job. But you know what I mean. Same thing for streaming. Different tools, different features. Back in the chat. Thank you. This is an awesome live stream. Well, I'm glad it's helpful. I'm probably going to end it here and wrap it up just because I got through the stuff I wanted to talk about. And that's all I had in my mind. I enjoy talking about workflow, working with clients, process, because that's the stuff that isn't just on a spec sheet somewhere. It's not a product you can buy and add to your cart and just go like, yeah, give me the how to negotiate with clients one, please. Add to cart, checkout. It's a little bit more I like the stuff that's complicated. Maybe it's not complicated, but just there is no clear right or wrong. And that's usually how I try and approach cameras and equipment too. It's not like, oh, this is the right camera, meaning it's the best camera and everyone has to shoot with the exact same camera. I don't know. I mean, I guess that's kind of the impression that some people give off about how they treat their equipment of oh, you have to have this. If you don't have this, it's not good. Or everyone shoots with this, why aren't you? And it's well, no, I like what I like for certain reasons, and other people like different things for other reasons. And same is true for like workflow and process of like different things work for different people. So sometimes it's valuable to learn like the good things of like what to do, but it can be just as equally valuable to learn what not to do. And maybe someone does something a certain way that works for them, and you're like, I would never do it that way because that would be awful for me. There's just a lot of nuance there and room to talk about stuff that isn't complicated necessarily, but it is complex. Maybe that's a better word. Looks and sounds great. The highlights on the side of your face look amazing. These ones are, they're actually GVM, which I believe stands for Good Video Making. Believe it or not, GVM LED. They're RGB LED lights from that I found on Amazon that were relatively affordable. I think they were like $300 or $350 or something like that. And so they are, you can, daylight balance them. You can tungsten. So you have that, it's not bicolor. It's like the whole spectrum, right? You can color balance it and dial in your color temperature, but you also have RGB. So I can switch them to red, to green, to blue, to pink, whatever. Like there's the whole 360 degree color spectrum, as well as saturation on there as well. So you can kind of like really dial in different colors for different looks and different moods. I initially was thinking about doing them in the background to color the background, but I ended up really liking how this looked. And it's just like straight from the light. There's no diffusion on there. There probably should be, but like this room is only so big. There's not that much space to set it up. So they're just like blasting. It's kind of nice. They have a feature on there where you can kind of spotlight the lens. So there you have a little bit of a spot compared to like the aperture lights, which are just kind of like on. Those ones have like a little lens. It's not really a Fresnel lens probably, but it's like a lens that you can spot a little bit, and then you can obviously dial down the intensity as well. And then I have a softbox LED right here with the little grid on it to kind of focus the light. And then behind the stuff back there, you see the other lights. Those are just like tube LED lights. I think, looks like one died. Probably somewhere through the stream it died. It's the one right behind the computer, but just for some little accents back there. Those are fun little tube LED lights that also are RGB. They almost look like little lightsabers. Find them on Amazon. They're relatively cheap too. So, and then there's a light up here. I probably can't pull it down, but just a softbox, because if I don't have this on, if I turn that light off, the hat, it's like everything is really dark, right? Obviously my face is exposed, but then like if I'm wearing black or something, which typically I do, this just turns like super contrasty. So I have another softbox. It's way overkill for this setup. Like, don't get me wrong, it's ridiculous the amount I have in here. But I set it up for fun, and I liked how it looked for, filming, as well as I was like, hey, I can do live streaming with this as well. It's kind of one in the same setup for the way I produce content. This is kind of like my older style of content, just like talking about topics. When I first started making YouTube content, when I first started making YouTube content, it was the typical like test footage, where it was just like shots with like text in the corner, and it would say the resolution and the bit rate and the 420 and all the technical specs, and it was just like camera test type stuff. And then I wanted to get into a pattern of doing stuff more frequently, so I was just like talking over photos or under photos, like voiceover with a photo. And then everyone was like, oh man, it's YouTube, it's video, it's a video platform, you should make a video. And I was like, well, I'm just talking. Fine, I'll turn a camera on. Here you go, here's my face. And did that for a while, and then was doing some more of like the live stream type stuff. So I did NAB live stream a couple times. That was a lot of fun for the people who were along for that journey, as well as some more like my GH5 review did really well. In terms of but that was like a lot of effort to put that together to to an acceptable level of like what I wanted. My biggest criticism, if I have one, like camera reviews are really helpful so people understand what they're buying and the features and whatnot, but they're also incredibly limited in the fact that most of the time camera reviews are just based off of test footage. They're not based off of real world stuff. Most of the time, if you're working with a client, it's like, do you really feel like it's not your footage? Like, they paid for it, they kind of own it typically. It depends on the arrangement, but a lot of times, like, people don't like necessarily want that stuff shown in that way because it's just like they own it. And then other times it can be like, well, I don't want to spend a bunch of money setting up a whole shoot just to review a camera, so that seems ridiculous. So what inevitably happens most of the time for most people is when they do reviews of stuff, it is just test footage of their backyard, of where they live, of their friends and family, and that's okay, it's fine. But it's a lot of work and energy and effort to put into that content. Like that GH5 review, it took me definitely over 40 hours to put it all together. And that's really hard to do. Like, you couldn't even do it daily, right? There's only 24 hours in a day. And then even to do it weekly on top of a working job, and you have to use your free time. And then, I have a family now to where, like, it's just a lot to fit into a week to produce that level of content. So with this, I wanted to take kind of a step back because I haven't been on making YouTube content for a couple of years, really. I did the 300D Mark II video. It's a bit like anything like that that's like a test or a review or whatever. Like, it takes a lot of effort to put it out there, and then to do that frequently. If you're just doing YouTube, that's fine. But then I end up, I find it kind of empty making just content for the sake of like reviewing products instead of making content for the sake of entertainment or storytelling or producing that level of thing, right? Like something like a chef's table or a TV series like Game of Thrones or a movie or something like that, like content, not the behind the scenes content. Both valuable, but as only one person who can only do so much, I gravitate towards, I want to put my time, energy, and resources into the real content and less on the making a really cool camera review video, which is valuable. And there's already plenty of people doing that. So I feel like I just personally like doing this, just talking about stuff. And it's less of like a workflow issue and a time sink on any one particular piece of content, and still allows me to put effort into other things that are more of like the creative content that stand up longer to the test of time than, hey, I reviewed the new DJI drone and then 6 months later they have a new one and you have to do a whole nother review for that one, and then 6 months later they have another one, and you're constantly doing new review after new review after new review for the newest stuff. And then who wants to watch a review on like the GoPro Hero 4? Those exist, I'm sure, and you could watch them as a piece of history, I suppose, but people want the newest stuff. So that stuff gets kind of dated, and technology always advances so quickly that you end up putting a lot of effort into something and you have to do it so consistently that it's really just taxing to do that, plus all the other stuff in life. So I find this more my speed. It's more the type of content I like to consume anyway too, more podcasts, talking, conversation type stuff. And I have other ideas of stuff I want to play around with, but that's just where it's at right now. Back in the chat. Maybe critique some of your viewers' work would do well. If your analysis are a third of what you show on the stream, it will be gold. As in like the way this looks compared to like what other people are producing. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take a look at anything if you want me to to give some feedback and critique. Usually, what's the best advice? There's a few things that once you learn them, it's really hard to make stuff look bad. I don't know if that probably sounds like arrogant or something, but it's not meant that way at all. It's just like once you learn some things about how light works, how cameras work, it's very hard to then like not do those things and make it look bad, because usually stuff looking bad is just the result of not knowing enough about, typically lighting is usually where it's at. Most people, this is the most common with people who have cell phones, and they say, hey, I need to learn how to shoot with a DSLR because my phone sucks and it doesn't take good photos. And then you can show them, hey, here's how you can take a good picture on your cell phone. And they're like, oh my gosh, well, you're a professional. Like, how do I learn how to do that? And it's like, the camera is not the limitation. Sometimes it is in low light or certain situations, right? Because it is a smartphone. It's not a proper photography camera. But a lot of it is about lighting, and typically that's where the majority of it is. And then like the added layer on top of that for photography is almost always color correction, whether it's in Lightroom or Photoshop. Most photographers that you see on Instagram or anywhere, like, it's not a raw photo, right? We all hopefully know that. It's edited, it's manipulated. The colors are intentionally skewed one way or the other to make it look much better than it did out of the camera. And you look at it and go, that's an amazing photo. I need to learn how to do that. And oftentimes it can be as easy as just like having the right LUT. Which I actually don't use LUTs all that much. LUTs are kind of like an input-output equation. So you have to have the right input to get the expected output. If you don't have the right input, you don't get the expected output, because they're not smart. There's no like, the LUT doesn't look at your image and go, oh, based on, an algorithm and AI, it's gonna tweak it a certain way, and then it's going to look at some other image and tweak it a certain way. It's like, no, if you give it a bad white balance, if you give it a bad exposure, it's not going to fix that, so it is kind of like good input equals good output. But that idea that you can use a LUT to color something to make it look significantly better is usually where it's at. So it's some fundamental principles about lighting, composition, lenses, shallow depth of field, focus, that kind of stuff that is very technical and is very like straightforward, and then using that to your advantage in any situation. And that's where like the experience comes along. Like, once you kind of get used to where light should be coming from, you can adapt any room or situation, even if you don't have lights, because usually there's like a window, or you can go outside, or there's something you can do to make it look good. For example, if you just shoot in like a doorway, or even better than a doorway, like a garage opening, the person facing out. So like imagine like the nicest, most beautiful garage you've ever seen. But like, if you imagine behind me is like a garage, and right here is the door. So I'm facing outside and the camera is right there. Like, it would look very similar to this, at least with this. So this is the key light. So you can see that. I can easily turn that one on and off. But you have a lot of, and granted, the sun can't be coming straight in your face, but if the sun is kind of like up above, and you're in the shadow, you've got all this beautiful ambient light flowing in onto the face. And then behind you is a darker exposure, because the light's not going to get back there as much. So immediately the subject is brought out. They're well exposed. You can set up edge lights or side lights, whatever you want to call them, a hair light. Doesn't really matter what you call them, but the backlight intentionally from either side, however you want to set it up, and then you can tweak it from there. But typically just someone facing out towards ambient light with like, from a garage or that type of thing, like a window or anything like that. You can even look at movies. It's not a surprise that a lot of movies feature people eating in diners for whatever reason. So they're sitting at the booth, and 9 times out of 10, that booth is next to a window, and one character's on one side and one character's on the other. So if I'm one of those characters, you have the window here and the restaurant here, and then the other character is over here. And so it's the same light, soft window light, big light source coming through, and it looks really nice. That's much better look for a diner than like in the middle of a restaurant with no windows around, and the lighting is just the house lights that are awful little pin lights, or what do they call those, like the holes, where the lights just straight down. Like, any architectural interior lighting is awful almost always. I imagine maybe there's some new buildings where people are taking in some like cinematic lighting principles, but most architects, I think that's who decides these things, just put these awful spot multiple lights, point them at the ceiling, so that way you have one uniform overhead like I do here. So I have one big softbox just straight overhead, fill the whole space with nice diffused ambient light. That's almost always that's like my number one trick, just piece of advice. If you ever go into a room and they have lights in the ceiling, which almost every room does, just turn the lights off, because they're awful. They don't serve any value. And use your own lights. Back in the chat, I don't know many YouTubers doing critique, specifically thoughtful ones. Your answers show how much you care. That must do well in a critique kind of video. I have a video clip I would like some feedback on. Yeah, absolutely. Send it my way. I'll take a look. Feedback, but I'm a noob in video. It's a bit painful to watch. Totally fine. Everybody starts somewhere. I second this. Video critique is a great idea. I'm just not afraid, maybe that's a probably overused phrase, but it's like, let's say I'm afraid that people would take it the wrong way. Oftentimes when you critique something, I think anyone can critique anything, right? Even my own work, I would value anyone's feedback. But oftentimes when you're critiquing something, the perception can be from other people that you somehow, as the critic, know more, are better. Oh, like your opinion, like let's see you do it any better, or what makes you the know-it-all expert, or I haven't seen you do anything like that. This happens a lot of times in like with movie critics and film reviewers. Oh, well, you're just a critic, you couldn't actually make anything, and it can be that same attitude or perception. And I would never want to give that off. I would never want to critique someone's work and then have it be implied that somehow I'm better than them, because that's not at all what it's about. Like there's people who are better than me, who are worse than me, but their feedback is valuable, because if you look at any piece of content you watch on Netflix, you watch something, everybody has a reaction to it. I liked this, I didn't like that. This was good, this was bad. That is very subjective. It is very personal opinion, and everyone's opinion and their feedback is valid to them and how they received it. Now, does their opinion equate to they know the solution? Like if they say, oh, I didn't like that, and I say, okay, so like what should I do? It doesn't mean they have a valid solution and that their suggestion is going to be the right answer. A lot of times people can recognize a problem, but they don't know a real solution or a good solution on how to fix it. But it's good to listen to the problem. What didn't they like? Oh, I got really bored is typically, right, a common thing. This was really boring. And look at it and look at and analyze your content. Don't ask them, well, don't ask them how to fix it. That's up to you to figure out. You have to look at it and go, well, why is it boring? Is it the music I'm using? Is it the pacing? Is it that it's all one note? It's like monotone. It's the same thing the whole time. How can I mix this up and make it more entertaining, more energetic? So it can be, because most of the time people equate boring to being too long. That's a false thing. Oh, it was boring. And then someone else will say, yeah, it's too long. Not true. Like, people love Lord of the Rings, and they'll buy the 4-hour edition and they'll watch them all back to back for a 12-hour marathon. People love Game of Thrones. People love Breaking Bad. People love what's a really good show? I don't know. I really like *Halt and Catch Fire*. I've watched it through it twice. If you haven't watched *Halt and Catch Fire*, it's incredibly underrated. Came out a little bit after Breaking Bad, and I think it just flew under the radar. But *Halt and Catch Fire*, I think it's my favorite show of all time. One of my favorite shows of all time. I don't know, but if you haven't watched *Halt and Catch Fire*, absolutely watch it. But anyway, these things are very long. They're very drawn out. People listen to Joe Rogan talk for a long time because he's having interesting conversations with interesting people. People will listen to podcasts daily. They'll watch the news 24/7. There is no such thing as too long. There is such a thing as too boring. And so they are not one and the same. Don't let someone say, oh, it's boring because it's too long, make you cut something shorter. It might be too long But that is not necessarily why it's boring. There might be ways to make it much more entertaining. Now, is it just the script itself? Is it the story? Is it the execution? There's a variety of factors that can contribute there, but it is false to say that just because something is long, therefore it is boring. Lots of stuff is long that is not boring. It's quite fascinating and quite entertaining, and people actually love it. Most of the time, most of the criticisms I would say about like modern cinema and just film and movies in general is that they're too short. Is that like, you can only do so much in 2 hours. I would much rather watch a TV series that has time to explore characters and storylines and like just the nuance and dimension of like growth and development and just telling a story. I like longer content, and I don't think it is inherently boring just because it's long. Some people might react like, I don't have time for that, which is valid. You don't have to have time for everything, but that doesn't mean it's boring. Back in the chat, man, I hope people in the creative field know to recognize the value of a critique instead of getting defensive. Be sure of the reasons you do your thing, but be open to how it looks to others. Yeah, and that's the thing. I think anyone asking for a critique would appreciate it, right? They want that review. My concern is more about the other people watching that critique happen and then projecting their own thoughts about like, oh, he thinks he's better than these people or anything like that, because that can typically be how it comes across. And I just wouldn't want to put that vibe out there. I don't want to ever shut anyone down from like doing their thing. The thing I encourage the most is just like make content, create, don't consume as much as possible. You have to consume some stuff because it's just like, it is the nature of growth and learning. Like you learn, but then make sure you're doing output as well, because learning is both directions. It's input and it's output. You learn something and then you execute on it so that you can learn more in the process of doing it. If you just consume and you don't create, you're missing half of the equation. And so if anyone is turned off by a critique or feels like it's just encouraging people to make, even if it's bad or they're not quite good at it yet or they have a lot of room to grow, it is still always worth it for them to be working and doing and putting stuff out there, because that is the only way they're going to get better. Oftentimes revisions or critiques can go that way where they are stifling and they push the creative down and they feel like, well, I might as well give up. I'll never be good. And it's much better to just keep going and failing as much as possible, because the more you fail, the more you learn in almost everything. Very insightful. Thank you for doing this. You're welcome, Vegan Bell. Controversy equals more views. Mwahaha. It is apparently true. Apparently with the Canon fans for the R5. It's funny, the Canon fans and the camera doesn't have a fan. There must be a better way to convey. The people who like Canon took issue with me criticizing the R5 because it's not a video camera. Apparently, it is a photography camera, even though they advertise it as an 8K, 4K 120, 10-bit 422 video camera. Like, it's like, that's how they advertise it. So I get that it's a photography camera. I get that people want to buy it to take pictures, but I also get that people would want to buy it to shoot video. I haven't written it off completely. I do think it's comical that it overheats, and they know it overheats, and they admit that it overheats, and then they say, yeah, it shoots 8K. I think that's kind of funny. I think it's kind of tragic. I've got one reserved to rent so I can test it out myself and see how big of a deal it actually is. I imagine it'll be a problem being in Phoenix and it being 120 some days. Do I want to be outside filming in that? No. But is it possible that it's going to happen? Yes. So just knowing the ins and outs, and not just like because you'll see a lot of the tests like, oh, it can record, 8K for, 10 to 20 minutes before it overheats, but I'm only going to film short clips. I wouldn't record that much anyway, which is probably true because the file sizes are enormous. And then also 4K 120. Oh, well, you're not going to really record for that long, so it's okay because you're just going to short little clips. And I always want to say to like all these videos of these people reviewing this stuff, it's like, but you stack a bunch of short clips together and that's going to add up to 30 minutes or throughout the day, right? So it's not just a continuous 30-minute, oh, it can't handle that, it shuts off. How fast does it cool down in between takes? So if I'm recording 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 seconds, and I'm only taking, 10 seconds in between, is it cooling down and heating up at the same level, or is it always heating up and then it's like cooling down, but it keeps heating up more and more and more to the point where it overheats? These are the things that I have to know based on the way I shoot, how it works in my setup. So I haven't written it off completely, but I am very hesitant to go buy it right away and say, yes, it shoots 8K and 4K 20, I can't wait. And then I go use it on a job and it overheats and I say, sorry everybody, I'm waiting for the camera. And then you see the kind of joke, I've seen it a few times, people putting their camera in like the fridge, which is like I would not recommend. If you've ever shot in a really hot environment and then gone to a really cold environment right away, you'll notice condensation on the lens specifically, but this is on anything. And also vice versa, if you're really cold and you go to really hot, like these radical shifts in temperature. So if something's really hot and you go really cold, it can fog up like a lens, and then that's moisture condensation that can then, if it's on a camera, can get inside the camera. So I wouldn't recommend putting a camera that's overheating and too hot in a freezer or a fridge, because that'll produce condensation, in which case it can be inside internally, and then you're getting moisture in the camera, which is not a good idea. I would not recommend that, which is unfortunate. I mean, if it's overheating, you want a remedy for it, so you want to cool it down really quick, but that might actually do more harm than good. I at least would be very, very careful doing anything like that, because you might think, oh, it's just cooling it down, but that radical shift in temperature can have some bad consequences. Back in the chat, I love Canon, and I 100% agree with you. They're the ones who decided to market the hell out of the 8K, almost not mentioning anything about photography specs. The first announcement of the camera was exclusively video featured. Before it was actually announced, or it was slightly rumored, they were like, hey, this is coming, and it is a list of video features, and it created so much buzz and hype for the camera purely off of the video capabilities. Oh my God, this thing's gonna do 8K RAW. Oh my God, it's gonna do 4K 120. Oh my God, it's gonna do 10-bit 422. Oh my God, it's the best. No crop. Oh my God, like stabilization. Oh, it's the best. Flip screen. Oh my God. And then you criticize it and you say, well, I mean, if it overheats, I can't use any of those features anyway. It's basically a brick. If it's too hot, I can't get any 8K. I get 0K out of it. But that's not valid because it's supposedly a photography camera, except I very rarely see people talking about it in regards to, wow, look at how amazing this photography camera is. They're not talking about it for taking pictures, typically, most people. Granted, I'm looking at stuff from a video perspective anyway, so I'm inherently a little like filtered that way, but I also it's on Canon. They're the ones that put it out this way. So I think it's totally valid to criticize it. And then, yes, I need to get my own hands on it, but also Canon is sending it to their friends, their people in their little pod, their little network of, hey, let's give it to these big YouTubers who are going to do cool things with our camera. And you do see it a lot of people like defending it, like, oh, it overheats, but like it's not that big of a deal. And it's like, but can I trust you? Like, I get that you're not, maybe you're paid, maybe you're not, maybe they just gave it to you to test, but like, are you being honest? Are you using it for real work? Or are you just making a cool YouTube review of a camera and you like Canon because they gave you a camera, so you want to say how amazing it is, and it's not that big of a deal that it overheats? Like, I don't know. I don't actually know. I can't get the thing until it's actually available for the public, so I have to pay money to rent it so I can actually test it myself and find out, because you never know. And most of the time, the stuff online, again, is those like tech reviews, those tech demos, the like test footage, rather than a real working environment and someone pulling their hair out because the camera keeps overheating and they're like, I need to get this shot. Like, everybody's waiting on me and my camera. Come on, Canon, why don't you put a fan in it? You know, like that is the scenario I'm envisioning in my head when someone says, hey, this camera can overheat. I'm picturing worst case scenario that I'm on a shoot and people are looking at me going, why aren't we rolling? And I'm like, wait, just 5 more minutes. The camera needs to cool down. And they're like rolling their eyes like, why do you have that? And I'm like, because it shoots 8K RAW. And they're like, oh, so you're shooting 8K RAW? No, I'm shooting 4K 24 because like otherwise the camera will overheat. And then it's like, and then I'm sitting there going like, I've been doing this, you know, like 4K 24 since the GH4. Like, this is not, that's not revolutionary. Yes, it's full frame. Yes, it's Canon. Yes, it's great. And you can love it all you want. That's fine. But it's still valid to criticize it, I think. Thanks for sharing your thoughts. You are most welcome. I will wrap it up there. I appreciate everybody tuning in for the live stream. It's fun. I enjoy this. It's a good time. And hopefully you enjoy it as well.